Hello everyone, Hafsa here. Last lesson, we've learned about animation in perspective, which gave us a lot of freedom and a lot of options when wanting to make more cinematic animations, because right now we can make animation in a 3D environment, kind of. And the next step to actually complete this effect is to be able to move the camera in the environment as well and match it to the movement that we're animating in perspective. A moving camera has a lot of uses. It can be a way to make a static shot more dynamic. It can create a certain atmosphere in a scene. It can reveal information, enhance emotion, and there are a lot of other creative ways you can use it as well. Today, I'll be teaching you how to make some basic camera moves and some tricks to creating the illusion of movement in 3D space using 2D illustrations. I will be teaching you how to do this with the FlipaClip and Procreate animation softwares, but this is not something that is usually done in the industry, because these softwares are not actually designed to have a moving camera in them. It's just tricks that I use to create my own animations, and this is where creating animation in a team becomes kind of difficult with these softwares. So from this point on, it's basically more for independent production. Of course, the same camera moves are relevant to other animation softwares, but you will probably have other features that will let you do them. But if you don't have an automatic camera movement feature in your animation software, this is the way to do it. In 2D animation, we are trying to sell the idea that the character is actually part of the environment where we're animating it, meaning that we want to make it seem like it moves inside it. We as animators don't actually have the time to animate every single detail in the background from scratch for every frame. And if we are aiming for a realistic art style, we might not even be possible to animate everything from the beginning, depending on the coloring and the brush textures that we're using. And because we can only work with 2D illustrations for the background, which are static and cannot change, it might seem like we wouldn't be able to create a movement in 3D space with just that, and we might need to use a 3D CGI model of the environment and the moving camera. But there are actually a bunch of tricks and smart compositing methods that we can use to create the illusion of movement in 3D space. I like to divide the camera movement into two different categories. The first is stationary lens changes, and the second is position changes in the environment. The stationary lens changes are camera movements where the camera itself stays in the same place in the environment, and the only thing that changes is the direction to which the camera points to, and how zoomed in or out it is. In this type of shots, you will experience a lot of perspective changes, because the perspective point will shift depending on the direction of the camera relative to the object that we're trying to film. In this category, you will find the zoom in and zoom out, and the panning camera movement. The second category is where the camera itself moves in the environment. In this type of shots, you might experience perspective changes because the camera is free to look around, but you can also follow different subjects while keeping the same perspective. In this category, you will find the follow, shake, track in and track out, and the spinning shots, as well as tracking pan. Now, I haven't really addressed this yet, but in animation we don't actually have a camera and an environment for it to move around in. So what I'm saying with this type of vocabulary is what we're actually trying to replicate in real life filming techniques. But we actually have even less restrictions than what you find with real cameras, because we can switch focal points and distance from the camera without actually changing the type of camera that we're working on, as we would have to do in real life in different types of shots. The only thing we need to be concerned about is how we're drawing the background, in which distance, and how we're going to move it. Because we don't actually have a camera to move around in animation, what we're going to move is the background itself. And by dividing the background into different parts and moving them in relation to each other, we can create the illusion of depth and add our characters into the environment. FlipaClip does not have an automatic camera feature. You will have to move the background frame by frame using the straight ahead method, so the number of frames has to be final and the character movement complete before we're actually tackling the camera movement. If you have your own software that allows you to add camera movement using keyframes, such as video editing apps, or more professional animation softwares, it might be easier to create camera movements. But unless you have a software that allows you to move the camera independently in every layer, there are moves that you might not be able to replicate using the features that is built into your software. We need to understand how each move works in order to recreate it. So even if you do have an automatic feature, it might be a good idea to stick around and see how it is actually done. And if you don't have an automatic feature, this method can be replicated in any type of software, and you can even do it on paper. As I said before, to create a camera movement in animation, we physically move the background to the opposite direction of where we want the camera to move. If you want the camera to move right, you move your background left, and if you want your camera to move up, you move the background down, etc. To actually move the background, you need to select your image and enlarge it so it's bigger than your frame and canvas. By copying and pasting the selection between frames without releasing the selection, you can continuously change the position of the background without changing its size, which allows you to create pretty smooth movements. So let's see how moving the backgrounds in different patterns can allow us to make different camera movements. Starting with the follow camera movement, this is one of the most common movements that you will see. It's something that follows the character actions and keeps them in frame, which can give more energy to the movement or just enhance it in generally. To make it, you have to make the background move in the opposite direction from the action itself. So first, we need to analyze the trajectory of the character movement and then mirror it to the other direction for the camera to follow. To plan the background trajectory, we need to choose an anchor point. The background has many details in it, but they all keep the same distance from each other. So by choosing an anchor point and moving it correctly according to the planned trajectory, your entire background will move correctly. In this example, I drew the background directly in FlipaClip so you can see the detail in the onion frame feature. But when using actual finished background, it will be one drawing imported as an image, so you wouldn't be able to see the individual details in it. Because of this, it's better to use the actual selection center dot as the anchor, and plan the trajectories from its location, with each new trajectory starting from the anchor point and position in the last trajectory. When using the selection point for your background, you need to be careful not to change its position on the selected photo, since the selection itself will move differently if you move this point. Once you have enough practice and develop good memory for positions of different things on your screen, you can go back to using points in the background itself as your anchor. This will allow you to have more complicated movements because you will be more free without actually planning the trajectories each time and just putting the background in the correct position in relation to your character. This is how I myself do the animation. I basically just remember the position of the details on the screen and move them relative to the character between frames. but this does take a lot of practice, so start with an anchor point. Okay, so now that we have the trajectory of the character planned, we just copy and paste the background between the frames while changing in position. Remember to not release the selection tool when copying and pasting, otherwise you will only copy the cropped part that is showing on the screen, and you will have to start from the beginning again, because you wouldn't have the entire background. As we've seen in the last video, the closer an object is to the camera, the faster it moves, and the bigger the spacing is going to be between each frame. Because usually the background is going to be further away from the camera than the character, we're going to animate it more slowly. By animating it more slowly, I don't mean creating a delay in the actual timing, because the frame has to match the character movement. To animate it more slowly, we're just going to make the entire trajectory smaller. And because the spacing will be smaller, it will seem like the background is moving more slowly than the character. This will also make sure that your background movement will not distract from your character movement itself. A very nice thing about using this animation method is that you have complete control on the camera movement. So you can actually plan your trajectories with ease in and ease out, which are completely dependent on your character animation, and can match it perfectly with both curves and timing. You can also play around with your trajectory to make some interesting effects with your camera. For example, by making it move more quickly or slowly than your character animation, or actively changing the spacing and timing of the trajectory to create different drag and delay effects with the camera, you can create more illusions of force and speed with your character animation. I myself use this technique quite a lot, because by making the camera lag behind your character action, you can create the impression that the movement is much quicker, even too quick for the camera to follow. And if you want to show force, you can add camera shakes and delays with your camera movement to show that the action is much quicker and stronger than the camera can handle. To create a camera shake effect, you basically use the same technique as your track follow, but instead of making your camera move in relation to your character action, with opposing trajectories, you're just going to move everything in your layers in the exact same random trajectory. Because what we're trying to replicate is the entire environment moving, which means that both the camera, the character, and everything else around it are going to be moving in the same way. You need to try and make the trajectory as exact as possible between every layer that you have. Otherwise, you might create some inconsistencies and it will seem like your character or parts of it are sliding around. Luckily, camera shakes usually have a lot of movement to them, so if you're making small mistakes, they wouldn't be very noticeable. The track in and out movement is meant to replicate the effect of your character and camera moving in the environment while keeping the same distance between them. This means that from the camera point of view, the character size is not going to change, so any type of movement that they're going to perform is going to stay at the same distance. The only thing that is going to change size in the shot is going to be the background itself. And the effect of the camera movement is created by changing the relative size of the background in relation to the character. To create the track in effect, you need to enlarge the image and make it seem like the camera is getting closer to each object in the environment. To create the track out, you just need to shrink it to make it look like it's getting further away. So, to keep the change in size consistent, this time we will choose an anchor point in the details of the background itself. Because we're not going to move the middle point in the selection itself, and actually want it to stay constant in order to keep the change correct. Once we have our anchor point in the background detail themselves, we're going to shrink it or enlarge it by using the grid feature. Just match the size of the grid to the amount of change that you want to create with your camera movement. The larger the grid, the easier it's going to be to animate faster movement, and the smaller it is, the easier it's going to be to animate slower movements. You want to have a good view of your entire background at once, so try and match your grid size instead of making it very small and then being unable to see where exactly your anchor point is. And where you're matching your anchor point to the grid itself, match it only to either the horizontal or vertical lines, and don't try and put it in a corner, because this is going to create inconsistent change in size. Another important thing to remember when creating a track in or track out shot is that your initial background needs to be big enough for the movement that you have in mind. If your background is too small, you wouldn't be able to enlarge it enough for the track in and out without compromising its quality. So it's better to draw a very big background and then move it around a little bit than draw a smaller background and then not be able to actually move it. The same technique for the track in and out is used for the zoom in and out. The only thing is that you need to change your character size in relation to the background instead of keeping it at the same size. This is pretty much similar to the shake effect, because we need to keep the same trajectory as the background. And to do this correctly, I recommend simply making the animation at the same size, and then slowly shrinking or enlarging it at the same rate as we did with the background. You can also create variation by enlarging your character in a different rate than your background, and thus basically showing it moving in 3D space, with your camera moving in 3D space as well, but not exactly tracking the character. The next type of movement is the tracking pan. The camera keeps constant distance from the character while it's moving to the side. This is similar to the track in and out moves because the character itself will stay at the same position on the screen. But unlike it, we need to create a special background to make it work. A size tracking shot is going to cover more distance than what is actually seen in a single frame. We don't have the time to animate each detail between each frame, and it will be extremely hard to keep the correct distance of each detail, because we're moving them to the side. And of course, similarly to regular backgrounds, if you have too many details or textures, it might not even be possible to animate them correctly for each frame. So in order to make a tracking shot, what we actually do is create a very long background and slowly moving to the side to create the illusion of movement. Basically, you're just going to draw a whole bunch of different frames in the environment in the correct proportions of your canvas, and then just put them side by side and connect them in a way that lets you have one continuous background with the correct perspective. This is good for pretty flat backgrounds because we don't need to create a different perspective for each part on the screen. But as you can see, just by having one long background and moving it to the side, we can create a 3D looking movement because the perspective at the edges does not change, and you can't really see the depth in the details in your background. This also relates to the fact that the farther the object is from the camera, the slower it moves, and the closer it is, the quicker it moves. This is also true in the big distances that you see in your background. And if each part of it is moving at the same speed, it doesn't look like it has depth to it. To make the background look like it has some depth, we use something called the parallax effect. I kind of mentioned it at the second background creation lesson. For this camera movement, you're going to need to separate your background into different layers depending on distance. So we have the foreground, midground, and background, as well as some overlays. And by moving each layer at a different speed in relation to each other, and the distance that we estimate them to have from the camera, we can create the parallax effect, which gives us the illusion of depth. We need to move them in relation to each other and the camera. So if you know the two layers are theoretically closer to each other than the camera, you will need to make their speeds more close to each other than any other type of details that you have in your background. For this, I recommend having both layers present on screen at the same time. This can be quite confusing if you have a lot of onion skin layers or if you have a lot of details in your frame. But I find that it's worth it in order to have a realistic looking camera movement with the relation of speed between each layer on your background. Also, I recommend using multiple frames in your onion skin feature. This will help you make sure that your layers are going in a constant trajectory and are not jittering too much. You can also use less frames if the amount of detail in your background is confusing and might be even too much to actually see clearly. But in that case, it might be better to actually play with the onion skin settings themselves and try and make something that is easier for you to see instead of just turning them off. Now, to create the track effect, we are going to move each layer at the same direction, but at different speeds. Or even sometimes almost not moving them at all if they're far enough from the camera. But we can also use a similar technique to create the camera spin effect. But in this case, instead of moving each layer at the same direction, we're going to move the layer behind and in front of the character in opposite directions, with the layer closer to the camera moving faster than the layer which is further away. And by matching the character animation to this camera spin, we create the illusion of your camera actually being in 3D space, even with only using 2D illustration. The next type of pan that we can make with 2D animation is the perspective pan. For this, we will again need a special background, but this one is actually even more difficult to do. Similarly to the tracking shot, we don't have time or ability to animate the changes to perspective between each frame. But this doesn't mean that we can't have perspective changes with 2D illustrations. Basically, you can break down the perspective shift in your frames for each part of your shot. And then you just need to take each different point of view and connect them into a single long background. You need to make sure that the perspectives are not clashing with each other, so that you don't have a frame in the middle of your movement which has incorrect perspective in it. There are basically two methods that you can use to create a perspective pan. The first is actually sketching your background in the animation itself, so you know for sure that the perspective matches your character. Of course, if you're a beginner, you can basically just add simple cubes in the correct perspective and maybe add a little bit of a grid. But since here we don't have one single perspective, you don't need to make your grid correct, and the only thing that is important is that your connections between each type of perspectives are going to be good enough to pass when adding your character, as the movement itself is going to be pretty quick with this type of technique. Then, after you have your rough sketches of the background within the animation itself, you just take them and copy them to your illustration and background creation software and just add them together into a single long background and make sure that the connection between them are smooth. Once you have your rough layout and placement of everything in your long background, you can now start adding perspective points into some areas that need more construction and try and make your grid correct. But this stage is actually not necessary and can make your entire drawing a little bit worse. Because what is important is not that each individual frame is going to be with 100% correct perspective, but that the entire impression that is given to the camera movement looks good. With this technique, you can't really add perspective points since we're changing the perspective all the time. In this case, you just need to make sure that each one of your perspective works together well with each other. So you need to plan your elements in a way that allows you to switch between them without it looking too jarring or with making too many incorrect perspective connections. But you can even use this technique to create changes with your horizon line, which basically lets you change the type of shots that you're working with. This usually means that you're going to make your background a lot longer, or that you have to make each part of your background a lot more deformed. This can be seen quite a lot in old cartoons, but they don't let you have very realistic background. So it's better to just make the entire background longer and then just add more details to the corrections of perspective. For this, the second method can be quite useful, because what you're going to do is take your base perspectives, add them to a single long stripe, and then use a smaller cutout in the size of your actual canvas and slowly fill it in between each different perspective. This way, you know that whenever frame you're looking at is going to have a perspective which looks good enough. This is why I think it is important to be able to create rough perspectives which looks correct without the use of a grid, as we've discussed in the background creation lessons. You wouldn't be able to have such an effect without using incorrect perspective, but you still want to make it seem like it is correct and at least make it passable when the camera is moving quickly. You do need to be careful though, because some details do need to have their own perspective point. And you need to make sure to keep in mind the relative sizes of the objects in your scene. So for this, I basically just recommend using both methods and connecting a whole bunch of backgrounds before you reach your final one and actually add it into animation. By combining different camera movement techniques and using them in a smart way with different elements and different layers, you can actually create the illusion of movement in 3D space quite well. And if you match the movements of your character and camera well, you can really make something that is very dynamic and can replicate a 3D environment quite well. I especially like to combine perspective and tracking pans with parallax effect to really create some dynamic and complicated movements. The final type of backgrounds that we can create into the animation is the background loop. We're going to use this type of background in cases where the movement is too long to create a tracking pan background for it, or when it's just too time consuming to create a long enough background. We might also use background loops in cases where your camera movement requires for the perspective to shift in different parts on the screen. This is especially common with animation where you have one perspective point in the middle of the frame. To create a loop, first you need to figure out the perspective in your frame and how it is going to change depending on the movement. Here you can see that I actually built a rough grid to figure out where everything needs to be on screen. Here I want to make sure that the building that I'm trying to draw still looks correct at every single frame. You can make your own grid like I do here, but you can also import a grid from Procreate if you want to make something that is more exact. You just need to add it as an image from the photo feature and then use it as reference. But since we're going to later polish the entire background in Procreate, I don't find it necessary most of the time, and just having the rough background is going to be enough for you to figure out the camera movement. Once you have your base perspective frames, you just need to add the appropriate amount of in-betweens to create a loop at the length that you want. This is quite obvious, but the more frames you have in your loop, the longer and smoother it's going to be. You also need to remember that you will have to render and detail each frame in your loop according to your background style. So you need to strike a good balance between the look of the loop and the amount of work that it's going to take you. Adding different objects in your shot, some of which are in loop and some of which are not, is going to give more variation and more interesting look to the environment that you're trying to create. Because not all elements in your environment might require a looping animation. Some of them can be done by using the regular track or perspective change. Actually, adding more static elements to your scene will make it seem more realistic and will give you the opportunity to lengthen the shot without it looking cheap and repetitive. You can see here that just by adding buildings in the background which move at different speed, I can create a better looking and more interesting shot. Not to mention that this helps me keep the work in check, as I can just draw each building as its own separate element and move them independently later on, which is much easier than drawing each one of them from scratch each time, especially if I want to give them a lot of details and use texture brushes. When you're adding the different layers of static images into your scene, remember that in order to keep the perspective correct and interesting, you want to use the parallax effect again. If you have multiple elements on your screen which can move without touching each other, it's a good idea to put them on the same layer in order to conserve the different layers, since we have a limit. Just make sure you give them the right speed by changing the spacing of each individual object on the layer. You don't need to have a different layer for each individual object because the timing of it is not related to it being on a different layer. But if you have an overlapping object, then you're going to have to use another layer. Otherwise, you will copy and paste it on top of the object below, and if you make a mistake, you wouldn't be able to change it because it will affect the object that you've covered with your pasting. I also recommend giving your looping object a layer of its own to make it easier to spot and fix mistakes that you see in your individual frames. This way, you can just copy and paste the entire frame when you need to repeat it, instead of selecting the correct part of it and replacing it in each individual frame, which will take considerably longer to do. Unlike the regular pan-track parallax, which has a set placement for each object in the scene because of the way that we made the layers, with a repeating loop and individual objects that you add to it, you can play around with the timing in which you introduce each individual object into the frame. You don't have to place all of them in the frame right from the start. By introducing different objects of different sizes and speeds into your frame, you can actually play around with the composition and fit it to give more interesting timing, pacing, and energy to your scene, as well as fit it to your character location on the screen, in a way that makes the entire composition better. The exercise in this lesson is to follow along and create your own variations of the examples that I've given here. You can either use your existing backgrounds and the existing animations if they allow it, or you can create your new backgrounds and animations as a sketch format. Try and include at least one perspective change background and one parallax background to test and practice your ability to create camera movement to different shots. Again, if you're making new layouts and animations, make sure that your lines are as readable as possible. An additional exercise is just to make different variations of perspective change background, using both techniques that I've shown you. You can either create a straightforward perspective change, which is just a one long stripe, or you can combine multiple stripes together to create a more complicated camera movement. If you're an experienced animator, you can actually try and create a background which fits the animation that we've made in the last exercise, with the many perspective changes. To do this, you can either combine multiple background layouts together, or you can actually try and animate a background loop. Again, make sure that you keep your proportions, perspective, and line quality consistent. Today we covered how to create different camera moves in animation, and the techniques that we're using to create the illusion of movement in 3D space using 2D illustration. We specifically looked on how to plan our background layout and the trajectory of its movement using analog techniques which can be replicated in every software. And we've also seen some tips and techniques that I personally use when creating my animation using Flip-a-Clip and Procreate. Next time, we're going to learn on how to connect different shots together and create your scene and animation with the correct energy and a readable flow. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye!